Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank the organisers of this conference for the invitation which has been extended to Ofgem to share our experiences of the energy transition. So I'll be talking about the energy transition from a regulatory and policy perspective. I'm very much looking forward to hearing the other speakers over the next few days and learning from their experiences as well. I think that no matter where you are on the energy pathway towards greater renewables, we have all got something to learn from each other. So let me initially make a few opening remarks. In the UK, we have a privatised energy system where we let markets and innovation develop and evolve. However, government and the regulator does take steps to intervene to achieve certain policy goals or to protect the interests of consumers. That's in respect of the government itself and the regulator. Those extensions go as far as actually imposing legally binding obligations on themselves. So the government and the regulator try to lead by example. And that's an interesting concept for perhaps where you have a predominantly state-owned system as well. And that those obligations are open to actually being challenged in court by persons who may believe that you're not fulfilling them. And there have been those challenges in the United Kingdom. So in terms of the types of interventions, they broadly fall into two categories. So on the one hand, we've tried to incentivize industry and consumers towards reducing emissions and a growth in renewable energy. On the other hand, we've put in place hard-edged, legally binding obligations from an environmental perspective and also in terms of carbon taxes with a view to reducing emissions. And we believe that these interventions have played a key role in terms of the reductions in emissions we've managed to achieve over the last few decades. So if I kick off with a little bit more about Ofgem. So Ofgem's the independent regulator responsible for regulating gas and electricity markets in Great Britain. We've got a legally binding principal objective to act in the interests of consumers. So we must always consider consumers when we make decisions. And that's consumers from a domestic perspective, but also business consumers. They are equally important to us. One of the legal considerations we must take on board is reductions in emissions and greenhouse gases whenever we make decisions. So again, that's a legal requirement of Ofgem. So if I move on, so just a little bit of background in terms of the framework which we are subject to. Overall, within the UK, there is a lot of regulation which the industry is subject to. We have EU law, we have legislation from central government, and we have regulation which Ofgem is responsible for. We also have technical codes and rules which are owned by industry, but Ofgem has a role to ensure that they work in the interests of consumers. There's been mention earlier today about grid codes and also the power failure instance in the UK a couple of months ago. That is being investigated by Ofgem in respect of the grid codes and whether they were being complied with by the various licensees involved. So a quick overview of the electricity market. There's nothing particularly different here. We've got a competitive supply and wholesale sector. We have got a distribution and transmission sector which consists of monopolies and where the prices are subject to approval by Ofgem. I thought at this point it might be interesting just to share with you a breakdown of a typical dual fuel, that's a bill for gas and electricity from 2017. You can see from this that the wholesale cost of the energy makes up less than 40% of the bill. The overall amount charged to domestic consumers. The other two aspects to note are that network costs make up just over 25% of the overall amount, and the cost of environmental schemes makes up 10% of the bill. Those are the schemes which provide support to consumers and industry and the energy system where they are pushing out renewable generation. So those costs are significant over the year. At the moment, the financial support, which falls on consumers, totals roughly £7 billion a year. And that is forecast to rise in the short term, but then to fall as more and more economies of scale kick in. So in terms of the energy transition, the system's been going through fundamental change. This included growth in renewable energy, new business models and approaches, and technical innovation. These changes present big challenges for policymakers and regulators. As the future is not completely predictable, our approach has been to be flexible as possible so that we provide a responsive policy framework that protects and empowers consumers and encourages investment. So this graph was actually touched upon by the Deputy UK Commissioner when she mentioned the significant growth we've achieved at the same time as significant reductions in emissions. And as I said, that these achievements have been on the back of the interventions that have taken place, whereby there's been significant financial support to incentivize a push towards renewables, but also some hard legal requirements which have resulted in penalties, I suppose, on high polluting plants such as coal generation. This slide shows that the reductions in emissions have predominantly been in the power sector. So again, we touch on the policies that have led to that over the years. In terms of the makeup of the sector itself, it's obviously going increasingly greener. Renewables share of generation capacity has reached 33%. In contrast, in 2000, it was a mere 2.6%. And as I said, this has involved a cost to consumers, which currently totals roughly £7 billion a year. One of the other changes we've seen, again, it's not unique to the UK, it has already been mentioned by other speakers, is around an increase in distributed generation. This has gone from 11 gigawatts in 2011 to over 22 gigawatts in 2017. And the current splits are that 71% of generation is connected at the transmission level, 24% at distribution, and we have 5% of micro-generation. And that predominantly consists of about 1 million small sites of 5 megawatts or less, predominantly consumers, domestic consumers who installed solar panels, and again, who receive financial support and the ability to sell back excess energy to the grid. So we've seen a lot of change over the last 2 decades, and the next slide sort of seeks to predict as best we can the likely changes that we think will come up over the next few decades, and obviously the challenges that they will bring. So the government has committed to a legally binding commitment of zero emissions by 2050, and there will be policies being developed to seek to achieve that now. We expect there to be increased demand for electricity. This will come from advances in technology in terms of AI, robots, artificial intelligence, robots, 3D printing. This will place extra pressure on the system. Thirdly, there's going to be a push towards electrification of the transport sector. And the government has set a target of having zero-emission cars and vans by 2050. I know that in India there's equally a push for electrification of the transport sector. Fourthly, there's going to be a push towards decarbonising heat. So we expect over the medium to long term a move away from gas as well. Sorry, last one is we think that data will increasingly play an important role. as the system becomes decarbonised, diverse and decentralised. So the key challenges we faced, again not unique to the UK, is intermittency, decentralisation and protecting consumers. And as I said at the beginning, we've got a legal requirement to act in the interest of consumers, so that we must take steps to protect consumers so that they don't face escalating charges, and also that they continue to engage with the market. We think that's going to be an important facet of the changing system. So in terms of solutions, you've already heard the word flexibility, and I'm going to say it again. We think that will be an important feature going forward in terms of the reforms to the markets and as new markets emerge. We're taking forward changes on network access and charging so as to avoid additional costs of reinforcement falling on consumers. Again, consumer protection forms an important part of the changes we're taking on, and again, better use of data, which we are going to encourage amongst the energy industry. So I'll provide a bit more detail about each of those. So flexibility is going to be increasingly central to the system. Technologies and applications such as storage and demand-side response, in our view, can help balance generation with demand and provide essential services to the grid. This can facilitate the deployment of solar and wind, whilst enabling greater uptake of new types of demand, such as electric transport. So firstly, in the area of storage, we are reforming our framework to encourage the development of storage facilities, and we expect those to nearly double by the end of the year. As part of our policy to encourage innovation, we've approved trials for the development of community projects where customers can switch between solar, the grid, and batteries using digital technology. With an increasingly decentralized system, we're taking forward changes on the distribution network side. So we're putting in place obligations for distribution network operators to work collaboratively and cooperate, in particular in terms of sharing information so that they achieve best outcomes for consumers. We think this is fundamental in a more decentralized system. With the need for more efficient use of networks, we expect to see the development of system operator functions at the distribution network level, and are taking forward changes to achieve that. One area where there could be further developments is the provision of flexibility services by generators at a local level, avoiding the need for traditional reinforcement. And the last box there, we think that it's increasingly important that consumers are given the opportunities around flexibility. In this regard, we want to help consumers gain control of their bills and how much energy they use. Smart technologies have a central role to play in this and can provide consumers with greater control and choice. So in the UK, we've rolled out smart meters. That's not gone entirely to plan, and that's well publicised, but the commitment is still there. So with smart technology, this will enable smarter tariffs so that consumers can decide when to use energy for certain appliances. For example, charging an electric vehicle at night when tariffs are likely to be cheaper. So with these developments, we expect to see an increase in demand-side response with greater opportunities for domestic consumers to take part in the energy system. So we foresee for consumers a more reactive role in the system. That will enable them to keep their costs in check, but also it would help with the balancing of the system and the challenges we're facing. So that's a move away from purely a passive role and something sometimes called prosumers, where consumers are actually also producers, whereby if they've got solar panels, they can sell electricity back onto the grid as well. So on the network side, we have RIO, which is our price control mechanism for the monopolies. We're in the process of preparing our next round of price controls, which will last for a period of 10 years. This seeks to reward innovation by setting long-term framework to encourage a more flexible and forward-looking approach from network companies. The second area of network regulation we are taking forward is changes in the area of making charges for the use of the network more cost-reflective. This will enable more efficient and flexible use of the network. And the two major projects, which I briefly mentioned there, are targeted charging reforms. Again, this is about making costs more reflective, in particular the legacy costs of the network. And the second is around access reforms. So this is about trying to free up grid capacity. At the moment in the UK, if you apply for a connection and are successful, you have that capacity for the term of that contract. There's no particular incentive necessarily to free up that capacity if you're not using it. So we were exploring ways of trying to incentivize that, again, with a view to encouraging a more flexible system, which will enable decentralized generation and storage to flourish. I mentioned innovation a few times already. So there's a particular initiative we've taken forward. I suppose partly in the context we appreciate in the UK there is a lot of regulation, and that can discourage new businesses coming forward. So we've set up a system whereby businesses can come to us and we can explore their new model and whether that would work within the current regulatory regime. Equally, where it doesn't work, we can take forward changes or try and provide some reassurance so that for a trial period they can proceed. So some of the trials we've approved relate to blockchain, which involves a community energy trial allowing peer-to-peer trading using blockchain to reduce customer bills. On the data side, we think data is going to be essential for smart energy, with smart electricity networks. DSR, storage, and smart tariffs will all need real-time data provision, and networks will need more data about their use of the system, about the capacity being applied to it. So again, we're trying to take forward changes which will free up the use of data because there are legal restrictions in place at the moment, and the government set up a data task force to assist with that. So my last slide seeks to sort of summarize some of our key lessons, in particular from a regulatory and policy framework. We think that it can be a really powerful tool to achieving decarbonisation. As I said, we've used it in two particular ways, in terms of, on the one hand, incentivising a certain type of behaviour, but then also trying to discourage it with other legal obligations. So it's been a bit of a sort of carrot and stick approach. We've seen that it can be a driver for innovation and change, whereby we can reform the framework to make level playing fields and remove barriers to entry and encourage innovation. It can facilitate a flexible system. Also, for our part, we've used it directly to try and protect consumers, in particular around pricing, and also to try and ensure that all types of consumers engage with the energy system. We don't just want the more engaged, the more well-off. We want vulnerable consumers also to be able to take part and are not then left behind with the changes taking place. The last lesson, perhaps more from a legal perspective, is that we think the framework needs to be responsive to change. Within the UK, it can take time to change the framework, but there are means when you develop it to try and build in more flexibility so that when it comes to making changes, you can do so quickly and without overdue legal process. So those were the sort of 5 key lessons from our perspective. I think they probably have some application across countries, in particular where countries may be developing their own frameworks, etc. We certainly feel that the element of consumer protection is really important, and also the element of actually government and regulators leading by example and placing legal obligations upon them, not just targets, but legally binding targets which can then be enforced against them. Thank you.